You're listening to the OverFunctioning Leadership Podcast, learning leadership concepts through life experience. Well, welcome, friends, to another OverFunctioning Leadership Podcast. I am Alex.
John.
Zach.
And it is wonderful to have your listening ears once again to our podcast. This is episode 19, I think, maybe?
Yeah, now that we removed all of the other filth, the zammers that were crap, like the High School Musical one. What was that, by the way, Alex?
What do you mean, High School Musical?
The High School
2?
Musical review, was that 2? Summer's Out? Is that what that was called? I don't even know.
I don't even know. Anyways, speaking of, it is on YouTube if you like to listen.
Yeah, with all of our other non-podcast related topics and our podcast related topics.
Yes.
They are now on YouTube, the YouTube. Search OverFunctioning Leadership and you'll find it.
Yep. So you can check us out there. I don't even know where we were going until you butted in, so I can't remember. But we're just going to go ahead and jump into, actually, let's recap our last podcast. Our last podcast was about one-down relationships. So, gentlemen, what is one-down relationships? What are we talking about here?
One-down relationships is where a person is maybe one down in authority. So examples of one down would be parent to child. The child would be in the one-down relationship in that example. Player to coach, could be employee to employer. Those are some examples of one-down relationships.
Yeah, or I remember growing up that I would play video games with my cousin, Nate, and I was the one down in which he would just crush me in every game. Mm-hmm. He would choose what player I was going to be in the game because he knew it was the weaker player and then just destroy me in every single game. If you ever remember Off-Road, I was always Mustard, which was the yellow car, which nobody liked.
Speaking of nobody liked, example of another one-down relationship might be Kevin Love to the rest of the Cavaliers.
Oh, are you jumping into the fable already?
Well, we'll get to that in a few minutes, but so that's something to consider.
Oh, okay. All right. So that was one-down relationships. There's a lot of talk about hierarchy. If you look up Roberta Gilbert's stuff, she has some stuff about hierarchy within extraordinary leadership, I believe. And so that's always a good read if you want to check that out. We are going to move into our fable section, and so go ahead and let the top down, let the breeze catch your hair, and listen to our fable. And with that awesome intro, we're going to go ahead and talk about Kevin Love, who is Kevin Love?
He is a player on the Cavs. Yeah, and for all of our Japanese listeners, we are in northeastern Ohio, and our NBA team is the Cavaliers, led by LeBron James.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I was really worried where you were going to go with that.
And that is almost the extent of all my knowledge. Tangentially, LeBron James also funds an education program at the University of Akron.
Oh.
So it's the LeBron James education program or something like that. And we have exhausted my knowledge.
You really started off really well and then just kind of fiddled out right at the end.
That's how I usually do it.
I was going to say, that's usually how all your conversations go.
Don't. Should have stopped.
Anyway, so LeBron James is the leader of the Cleveland Cavaliers. And, geez, was it 3 years ago when he came back to Cleveland?
I think that's about right.
Something there. And Kyrie Irving was also on the team, and he was an all-star player. And then in the stroke of luck, and when LeBron James came back, they were like, you know what, we're going to get Kevin Love from the Minnesota Timberwolves. And as they did that, they went ahead and they made a triangle. And everybody just loves a nice triangle. Not the triangle by the Lakers, who was imposed by Phil Jackson.
Phil Jackson, yeah. Tex Winter's triangle offense.
Yeah, so not that, which I know that Zach has lots of information about. He can tell us.
I know all
later.
about that. I love triangles. I know all of the degrees. 60 degrees, 30 degrees, 90 degrees. Continue, Alex.
Anyways, so Kevin Love, it's just interesting if we look at it. He's always been the outsider. So I don't know. John, what do you think? I mean, we've talked a little bit about this. So as an outsider, what does that mean?
Well, the outsider in a triangle is the one that's focused on. Oftentimes, the insiders look at the outsider as the problem. in Murray Bowen's words, that person would be known as the identified patient. And during the Cavaliers' early struggles, back, when Kevin Love came to the Cavaliers, he got hurt a couple times and really underperformed. And there was a lot of talk that he was the problem. And that focus of what's going on, a basketball team or a system of any kind, there's a lot of moving parts to it and very complex, but it's tempting, especially when anxiety gets high, to find the one who's at fault and point a finger.
Yeah, so this leads up, actually, our topic today, which I failed to let you know, is, are things getting worse? That's the question we're trying to answer today. And so with the Cleveland Cavaliers, if anything ever happened that was wrong, we are getting worse, and that's because of Kevin Love. It's always been like that. We're going to trade him. He's always on the trading block. We're going to try to get rid of him all the time. So where this leads into, he came out with an article online, I forget, the Players Tribune, I think. Anyways, just recently about this year he had a panic attack during a game. So, Zach, surmise perchance why he would have a panic attack knowing the knowledge that we just gave you.
Well, sounds like there's a lot of stress and anxiety just surrounding Kevin Love. Everyone's looking at him. If anything goes wrong, he's the first person who's going to be looked at, first person who's potentially going to be scapegoated and blamed. And if your mind's there and not on the game, the rock, as they call it, then you're going to seriously suffer in terms of performance.
Yeah, so this isn't really shocking, I don't think, for us to, especially since we just talked about Kevin Love being blamed for everything all the time. So when this story came out, John, you and I discussed how, this isn't, since this anxiety is being pushed upon him as the one in the triangle and being scapegoated that way, we would not know until today that, this anxiety was pushed on to him to a point to where he had a panic attack during a game. And so maybe talk about, your limited knowledge about panic attacks maybe, and maybe why that would happen to him because of the anxiety.
Yeah. This is the theory, the Bowen theory, that offers a way of viewing this issue, and it may or may not be true in this situation, but it does offer a different way of seeing it. And so when one is focused on by others intensively over long periods of time, the anxiety in any system tends to be offloaded unequally onto someone who's considered to be the weakest. Now, how that's measured and who they decide is the weakest is pretty complex, but typically there's one, or in this case I would say there's one that is over-focused on and takes on the brunt of the anxiety. Mm-hmm. And when one becomes more anxious, there's physical and mental symptoms, and panic attacks can be one of those symptoms.
And I would say that this could be the leader. I mean, this person could be the leader who's being picked out, and then it could lead to panic attacks. Nobody is free from the anxiety that's going to be pushing around, because I think it's easy to say, okay, well, this is the least differentiated person in the system who is being attacked with this anxiety. But if that person is in a system in which there's a lot of people who are not well differentiated, who don't have solid selves, who don't have guiding principles, who are constantly shoving their anxiety on other people, well, if you are the leader of that type of group, or the most differentiated of that, you're going to get a lot of heat a lot of the time. And so I'm not saying that the Cavaliers, although this year they have been trading away their whole team for other players, mm-hmm. which also signifies that something was amiss when it came to anxiety. And I would say even LeBron James even showed that by, not playing very well so he could get rid of players on his team. But I think it's interesting because I think it's always interesting because you always think that the weakest person is the least differentiated, the least mature person is going to be the one that's going to be poured out upon, which is true a lot of times. That's your identified patient. But in turn, this could also be maybe the strongest person in the group too.
Yeah, so Kobe Altman, if you're listening and you want some help with Bowen theory and your team,
mm-hmm. Some leadership guidance,
the three of us would be more than happy to come up to the queue and offer our perspectives.
Yeah, I heard that they like to go over the luxury tax for their team. We'll go ahead and You can go ahead and just pay us over the luxury tax as well, however many millions that is.
Yeah, whatever that looks like.
Or I'll take a free ticket, baseline ticket.
Oh, yes, basically. We get nosebleeds.
Ticket to the Canton Charge game.
You still feel the fire, though, when they shoot the fire off. And that's what I really like about the game. It's important to me.
Okay.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, fire.
Singeing off those eyebrows?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, the eyelashes.
The eyelashes?
Well, all this talk of Kevin Love has just made me want to talk more about things getting worse. So the overall question that I know that I've been addressed with, that I've heard before, usually the stereotypical way that you hear this question is there's some older person saying, well, back in my day, it wasn't blah, blah, blah. Now it's just getting worse and worse. But I think it's a worthwhile question to figure out, especially with our minds on anxiety and Bowen's family systems theory, based off our knowledge, whether that's true or not. So, gentlemen, are things getting worse?
Oh, man, when you were talking about those older people who tend to focus, negatively on something and then just be like, our country's going down the drain, that sort of thing. It just took me back to 4 years ago. I was at an internship in North Carolina, and I had this really nice older couple invite me into their elderly group for after church brunch, lunch, whatever it was. And at that time, oh man, it was Medicare. Medicare was the indicator of how our country was going down the drain and how their retirement was at risk. And I mean, it was the cause of all their problems. And they're like, it's just getting worse from here.
I actually posed this question in my leadership class, leadership concepts group of students that I meet with on a daily basis. And I said, hey, tonight's podcast is about are things getting worse? And I asked them to give their ideas and perception. And I have some real sharp kids in there. Molly was one that spoke, and she talked about how from measurable statistics, when you look at the income and wages, at least for some, it's somewhat stagnant, but the economy is doing well. Unemployment's down. People are living longer. Education levels are up for many people, yet there's this perception that things are getting worse. And so the question that she posed is, if you have some statistics, and certainly you can pick statistics to support anything, but if you have some statistics that say that in some ways life's getting better, then the conclusion that things are getting worse, which many people agree, where's that what's the word I'm looking for?
Evidence.
Where's that evidence? Where's that one goes this way, the other one goes that way? Where's this? I asked the same question in class today, and somebody gave me the word, and I'm like, that's right.
Fork in the road?
We'll do fork in the road.
Yeah.
So I don't know why some evidence points yes, but the conclusion is no.
So first chances that lead us into our society being data-driven. I've read many things about our current society being like almost addicted to data. And as teachers, I know that John and I have been flooded with, I think, almost, not every time, but definitely every year and maybe every other month, we talk about assessment data for kids, what tests they take and how they do well on tests. And it's all about data. I don't know. What do you think, Zach?
It's just interesting because we've read in A Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman, the late. Oh man, the beginning of that book changed my life. But it talks about how data-driven leadership is one of the potential failings in leadership, because when you're leading by the data, you're not leading because of the people. And it's those relationships that you're forming and that you're directing and that you're influencing through that is what really guides and directs people towards a common goal. And if you are basing it off of this generalized data that might be accurate on a whole, right? But what does that say about your group of people? If we're leading by generalizations and general trends, the whole issue with statistics is, and you see this everywhere, you get these really long mathematical problems, and it's because you have to deal with this whole idea of a population or a sample size. Like, how much data do you have to get before it's an accurate representation of the group? And there's no guarantee that what you're taking and looking at is actually a representation of, say, the people that you're leading.
Yeah. And then, John, is this leading us to herding then? And less individuality?
Well, that's one of the hallmarks of an anxious system is herding together and people thinking alike about a particular topic. When one forms a different opinion, oftentimes that person is either ridiculed or pushed aside. So to ask the question, are things getting worse? I think if we look at, is society becoming more anxious? I think, Ed Friedman in the book you mentioned talked about, the presence of herding together, reactivity, blaming others. Those are three characteristics.
Quick fix mentality. Lack of well-differentiated leadership. Those are the five.
Mm-hmm. So I guess for our listeners, ask yourself the question, do you see the push to togetherness where individuals are, standing alone is much more difficult to stand alone with thoughts and opinions? I think if you look at those characteristics, it seems like I wouldn't say things are getting worse, but I might say things are getting more anxious. Maybe I'll say that.
Okay. So I guess my question, I'm going to use an example here, John, just based off what you said about things are getting more anxious. So I'm trying to think of my childhood, and maybe, John, you can think about yours too, but I remember growing up in a neighborhood, and I don't live in a neighborhood now, so this might just be a bad example, but I remember riding around my bike and just going wherever I wanted in my neighborhood and not worrying about, anything, getting captured by whoever, is that still true today? Zach, you're the youngest one, so maybe you can answer that question. Like, was that possible? Is that still possible today, do you think? Or are kids just looking at their phones and on video games? Is that why they're not outside anymore? Or what do you think?
I think there's a plethora of issues, but you definitely see two things. You don't see as many kids outside wandering around. I don't know if that's because I'm an adult working an adult job, so I'm getting home when it's dark. So it might just be that. But I definitely see, at least in my peers, an increased attention on technology.
Okay.
I can't imagine that I have trouble imagining that people are as social in the real world as they are on their phones. I have to feel like there's that spectrum that is just increasingly shifting to the right. Surprisingly, though, I think Facebook is dying, and I think we're on to things like Instagram and Snapchat, where you're just constantly feeding through more and more people as compared to it's what Facebook used to be, except now we're sharing experiences rather than thoughts and feelings. So that you wish you could be that person, or you can see where other people are, but you're not getting to know them any better.
Is that an indication for things getting worse?
I would say so. I think that if we think that we're relational beings, which Bowen's theory definitely seems to indicate that relationships are things that you influence through, and that's like the basis of leadership, then I don't know how you can do such a thing if you're not in a direct and meaningful relationship with people, except over the interwebs.
So throw away your cell phones.
So
or go to the light phone 2.
Yeah, the light phone 2, which is a standalone phone, not at all connected to your phone. You have to have two phones, a smartphone and a light phone, so that you can get away from your smartphone.
You could put a restraining order on your phone.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Yeah, bury it in your yard.
Feed it to Misha.
There's something to be said. I mean, Ed Friedman, I feel like I treat this book as like gospel at times because it's just so interesting. But I mean, he does have a whole chapter literally titled "A Society in Regression," and it talks exactly about this thing. and he talks a lot about America and where it's at, and it's really hard, as we sit here and talk more about, because we live in the U.S., is this the same in Japan? Is this the same in, Russia? We don't know because we're not there. So I don't know how valid that question really is. But in a nutshell, are things getting worse on the side of Bowen family systems theory would be based on what?
Yeah, I'm been thinking through this question, and when we come up with topics, we think through them, but we're not really sure what direction we want to take it. But I don't think things are getting worse. I just think we're less mature as people, and our relationships are worse. I think there's more uncertainty in our world, economically, and I just think the response of the organism in the midst of a highly emotional setting determines whether things get better or worse. And I don't think we're responding very well. This is a macro view, of course, but I think we don't respond as well. And I think relationships, Zach, you hit on the relatedness piece where the phone has taken the place of real human relationships and not very well.
So as we get further and further away from the Constitution of the United States, so the birthing of the U.S., do you think there's something to be said there about generationally it getting further and further away from maturity and more anxious based off of just the society we currently live in, as opposed to when it first started and when people were immigrants and then they came from places where they wanted to be here and they had maybe different backgrounds and they had individuality because they were from different places. Do you think, I don't know, I haven't really interacted with too many immigrants into the U.S., but I don't know, I like to think, and maybe you guys have, I would like to think that the people that I do meet, number one, they want to be in the United States, and number two, they already have inbred individuality because they're not from this country. So they don't automatically get filtered into...
They're immediately at contrast to all of the people around them.
Yeah, so they're Kevin Love.
Too many sports references for me. Let's talk about tennis. Roger Federer, anyone?
I've heard of Roger Federer.
Somehow he's still playing. I'm
he's
not sure.
crushing it, and he's just ancient.
Yeah.
But
what do you think about that? Like a generational, I just wonder if the generations have gotten to a point to now where we're just kind of accustomed to this lack of maturity as we go through.
Yeah, well, I'll give an example. And someone I was talking with recently and looking at some challenges in their family, and we spent some time going back through generationally and the maturity level of this was on this person's mother's side. And so this was a person I was speaking with that was having a contentious relationship with a daughter. Ed Friedman says, in his book, Failure of Nerve, he talks about how his statement is 100% of the time this is true, which I always pay attention when someone
At least it's
says
not
that.
over 100%.
Right.
That really irritates me.
It's not 110%.
Yeah.
It's 100% of the time this is true. He says in this example that a mother who has a contentious relationship with her daughter almost always has a conflictual relationship with her mother. And so as I was speaking with this person, they said that's absolutely true. And we went up the female line of succession, and there is contention all the way up this family tree back multi-generations of shame and disagreement. And so when a particular person doesn't take their own maturity seriously and grow themselves up, there are prices to pay generationally down the line. And I'm wondering if the higher anxiety that we have are due to that multi-generational process that sets roots in certain individuals, and they take more of the symptoms and have therefore more anxious symptoms, whether it be mental or physical.
I think the perspective of our population is a lot different now than, say, when the Constitution was written. We're talking about, individuals coming into our country, leaving a situation, trying to make the best of their life, coming to a new place specifically for that. That seems like a glass half full sort of perspective. Mm-hmm. And you look now, and we were talking about statistics, depending on which ones you choose to pick and argue for your side. We have less employment. We have higher wealth. Millennials, I just read recently, are saving more than the baby boomers were. So they're going to be wealthier when they're older, apparently. But you look at that, and I know I read several times over the past couple of years this idea that your self-satisfaction is based off of the people you're comparing yourself to. So if you're in a social circle and they are all better than you in some way, whatever you're comparing, whether it's wealth, whether it's satisfaction in a marriage, whether it's, I don't know what else, how well fed you are, you look at that, and if you're at the bottom of that, regardless of whether you're in the top 10%, the 90th percentile, or whether you're in the bottom 10, you're going to feel the same as the person in that opposite percentile. If you're at the bottom of your social circle, you're going to generally be less satisfied than the person at the top of your social circle, which is an interesting thought if we look at our population now in this sort of prosperous time that we might be in. We're looking at it, we have it really, really good, but there's always someone who has it better.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole point Facebook started, right?
That's the whole point.
Two things that you guys mentioned that I think are really helpful. Number one is, how goal-oriented am I, or is a person? How goal-oriented are they? And then number two, Friedman talks about people grow through challenge and not comfort. And so in both of those situations, an immigrant coming to the United States is challenged and has a goal in mind, and to pursue, a life that has a job and some stability and a dream to kind of fulfill. And I'm wondering if, especially in a culture that is fat with materialism, if we lose the sight of goals, where our goal is just flipping through the phone and not really having much to do, and we comfort ourselves, we medicate ourselves with lots of different things. So it's comfort and safety, and we've traded challenge and risk for comfort and safety. And I think it makes us, it's just not the way we're supposed to live as human beings, and I think we feel it.
Yeah, I mean, the specific words Friedman talks about is it's a desperate quest for certainty.
Yep.
Using the data, everything's got to be certain, got to be safe, all of those things that you just said, exactly what he was talking about. I mean, yeah, having lower pain thresholds overall too. But as we talk about this, I would say of the people that we know who may not, with this, are things getting worse, have had, if we ask this question, somebody who's had worse things happen in their lives, seem to have higher pain thresholds and tend to be more self-differentiated, dependent upon how they went through that situation. It could take years for somebody to get to that point, but somebody who's been very prosperous in their life is very different from somebody who's had a very rough life and gone through a lot of different things. There's something to be said about that within what we're talking about.
There's that interesting statistic that it's the family business fails by the third generation, I believe. And you think about that. You have the first person, the grandfather, who built this company up with his blood, sweat, and gristle, what
Gristle?
yeah, he's just a meaty old tough man.
Yeah.
I'm thinking Poe Bandino,
Yeah, something, a sharecropper farmer and a hardworking man.
Yeah, something with the crops and the sweat of his hand. I don't know. But anyway, you have that grandfather who did that, and he passes it down to his son, who might not be well-equipped, who might not be as invested, but he saw the passion and the effort that his father put into it. And then you go down one more level, and it's just an expectation. It's something that they deserve. It's something that they didn't have to work for. I'm not sure how accurate that is, but that's just the vision that is portrayed in my mind of that situation.
Interesting.
Well, gentlemen, overall, it sounds like that the way that we're looking at it is the answer to the question, are things getting worse? I'm not sure things are actually getting worse. They're just getting more anxietal. And so with more anxiety comes less self-differentiated in a lot of ways.
Less
People-
flexibility.
Less flexibility. You have more sabotage, so leaders aren't able to do the things they're supposed to be doing or want to do, nor do they have the nerve to stick with their decisions. Any other pieces, parts that if you look at our society, these are the main themes to why it might be, what higher anxiety will do to it.
Emotional outbursts is just the thing that keeps popping into my head. These reactions, it's not rational, it's emotional. And I just think of what are our outbursts each time we see a national tragedy portrayed on the news, right? It's very, very emotional. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but I don't always see the rational side of things. I can often see two extremes warring emotionally for their side.
Yeah, are things getting worse? When you have a challenge, can you get through it? And I think when people get more anxious, when a society becomes more anxious, more black and white thinking, chronic anxiety increases. Chronic anxiety, we've described it in several ways here on the podcast, but it may look something like, I'm not sure if this happens, I'm able to handle it. So I'd prefer to marry my smartphone and interact with people that way versus actually having human face-to-face contact. It's just more predictable.
So we're talking about this. All of the kids, so from Florida, the shooting that happened in Florida, there's been a big movement of, walking out of schools. And this has maybe had, I don't know, I don't remember too many other things have had this much traction when it comes to the talk about gun laws and all, and we've talked about that on another podcast, but I do find it interesting, and I don't know if there's anything to this, but that high schoolers are standing up and doing something that's about this that is in a response to the things that are happening. Now, some of this is going to be emotional reaction, which is totally understandable and needed. We're not saying that emotion needs to be bereft of what we're doing, but I do find it interesting that it is high schoolers who are taking the step in some ways that that have caused the most attention to what's going on with the whole situation with guns in school. Is there something to be said about that? Is it a microcosm of just a fleshing out of, okay, anxiety is high, and who maybe are the least differentiated, just overall because they're young, is the high schoolers? And so usually within a system, the least differentiated people are the ones that are going to react the loudest. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I've heard the phrase, we can learn so much from young people. And I understand that. It sounds nice and it's a wonderful sentiment, but when adults fail to lead, there's a vacuum of leadership. And I think that vacuum is being filled by young people who are passionate, but I would say naive in many ways, just because of life experience. But so they're long on passion and emotion and verve, and but I'd say short on the macro view of complexity. But they're, I think, filling a role that adults have given up and refused to take a stand. And so I see their frustration. You and I, Alex, teach school, and so I see that, and I understand and I want to support that. But I have to say that I think it's a failure of leadership has led the ground for kids saying, okay, I guess we'll have to take the lead.
Yeah. So, Mr. History, is this like a historical part to say to this, that in the 70s, we had, Vietnam and all this stuff, and who are the ones that came out and spoke up about it? People from college, right? These are kids in college mostly, right? We have Kent State right down the road. People are getting shot because of that, because they were protesting against different things. Is this a historical account of what happens when you don't have leadership at the top? I don't know. I'm just kind of trying to piece together. History repeats itself, right? In some ways.
That's a good question.
Well, thank you. I like good questions. You go ahead and ponder and chew through that. Maybe get a little gristle.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've handled this question to the best of our abilities. Zach, do you have anything else? I felt like you had something on your mind.
Yeah, I just have one last question. I don't know how it pertains to this topic, but when we're talking about chronic anxiety and when we're talking about acute anxiety, what if, what are we afraid of? I see when there's all this anxiety, but what are we afraid of? If it's the gun debate, we're afraid of guns, we're afraid of violence done upon us, and I totally understand that. But that feels like a blip overall in this anxiety driven time. So what are we afraid of?
That's a great question.
It could be a multitude of things, and when it's a what if, man, it really stretches to what ifs can make fears of everything, right? And I strongly believe that anxiety, especially chronic, well, acute would make sense too, that immediately will start filtering in that fear of the what if. Now, acute is more what is right now.
Yeah.
You're still, there's a car coming at me, or, whatever, I got to handle this. But at least in the acute level, it's going to be handled at that point in time. Chronic anxiety is not being handled whatsoever. So it's easy to have those what ifs, and here's all the little things that we have problems with, and here's all the technical solutions that we can fix all these things because of data and, whatever. So,
yeah, and that's if we're talking actionable steps to do in times of anxiety, whether it's an overarching national anxiety or an individual crisis, start by thinking rationally what could actually happen and how am I going to respond in those situations.
That's really tough.
It is tough. Anxious societies have a hard time separating real threat from perceived threat. Are just not very discerning.
Yeah.
It's a great skill to have, but anxious societies don't do very well at being able to parse that out.
Yeah. So to wrap this up, I would encourage our listeners, if you really want to know, what's the action steps, what are the things you can do next, you can go back and listen to some of our podcasts about being self-differentiated or guiding principles or even just base level anxiety, which we started out. And there's a lot of those things that we talk about, okay, what are the action steps that can you take? And it really does come down to being self-differentiated. How do you become self-differentiated, which is another podcast we have. We're guiding principles. There are some things there that are definitely doable, but they're not technical solutions to an adaptive problem. It is a problem that's, is adaptable, and it's going to take some hard work on your end individually to figure out, how do I grow as a person? How do I become self-differentiated? And these are the things that it takes time, and it is a lifelong journey. So, yeah, that's sorry, there's not a 5-step program.
Yeah. No, if you're looking for a book, you mentioned earlier, Roberta Gilbert has an excellent book called Extraordinary Relationships. She's written several books. That's one of them. I've also have read recently a book called Growing Yourself Up by Jenny Brown. And so that's a book that I think for our listeners who would find it really helpful about not blaming others, but this is where I'm at, and how can I mature myself? Those are two good books that I think you may want to check out.
Yeah, awesome. Well, with that, if you want to get a hold of us, go ahead and get it. We have an email at theofpodcast@gmail.com. That's theofpodcast@gmail.com. Shouting out. Oh, actually, excuse me. Before the shout outs, we also have Jesse Huffstetler. Why am I trying to say to him? That is a shout out.
Yeah. Shout out to the Starfish Limiter.
Yes, he's
John's
limiting.
favorite technical piece of equipment.
It is my favorite.
And then we're also on YouTube, right? And you can get us on iTunes and on Google Play, Simplecast.
Yeah, we're currently at 27 subscribers on YouTube.
Oh, yeah. We need to boost that up. And actually, we have more subscribers than we have views on our last video. So, hey. And this video is going to be great because it's going to be almost all black because my video camera ran out of battery. So, just enjoy that.
So if you want to listen to us not on the podcast, you can also listen to us on a video platform.
Yeah. So, with that, I think we're ready to roll. And with that, I am Alex.
I am John.
And I am Zach.
And we will catch you next time.
See you later.
Bye.